In a recent tweet made by Charlie "Fuck GTO" Carrel, he, in typical Charlie fashion, made a bold, unequivocal claim that if you're thinking of game theory concepts at 50 NL or lower, you're destroying your game. This tweet caught my eye because one of the primary goals of this channel and GTO Check is to bring game theoretic concepts to newer players. In my opinion, the traditional view that beginners should play purely intuitively and exploitatively, and only experts should bother learning game theory, is completely backwards. So who is right? Well, in order to flesh out this question, we need to first establish what game theory is, because I think a lot of the bickering back and forth that occurs between GTO and exploitative advocates is simply definitional. Wikipedia defines game theory as the study of mathematical models of strategic interactions among rational agents. The founder of modern game theory is widely regarded as John von Neumann, who first proved the minimax theorem, which, in the context of a two-player zero-sum game, determines the strategies for both players that maximize their payoffs against each other. These payoff maximizing strategies are found by calculating all possible outcomes across all possible combinations of actions, and then selecting the mix of actions that minimize the opponent's payoff, which in a zero-sum game maximizes hero's payoff. In this video, we will demonstrate that this process of considering the strategies for both players and attempting to maximize payoffs given such strategies is, in essence, the exact same process that Charlie uses to make the bulk of his poker decisions. To illustrate, we'll be reviewing Charlie's commentary to a Play and Explain video posted by Stefan Sontheimer, who is one of the best that I've seen when it comes to fluently blending baseline equilibrium play with exploitative adjustments.
Very easy looking hand. We got against a recreational player, probably, a little aces 4-bet. Small c-bet on the flop, and we get min raise. We're always going to be c-betting this small. I'd probably even go a little bit smaller. The reason for that is that if he does happen to have something like ace king, ace queen, we want him to stick around because he's dead. So I might even go something like 4.3 big blinds, because if he does then have ace king specifically, and probably ace queen, he's sticking around and they're absolutely dead. And if he does happen to have a jack or he has pocket queens, then we're just getting all of the money. So the next question is, once we min raise, get your answers out in the chat, boys. What is this guy's range looking like? I wouldn't put kings in there too much because I'd expect kings to shove pre. I wouldn't put flush draws in there too much because I'd expect them to shove instead of min raise. Because the thing about a flush draw is if you min raise and the other guy calls, you're then on the turn, which might be a brick, and you only have one more card to try and hit. So everyone always, and they should try and get all of the money in these kind of spots with the flush draws. With the problem with calling is that he's just min raised, and I said it's probably to try and induce something like ace king. Very, very infrequently will you find somebody that's min raising to just fold. You know, if he's min raising pocket tens or pocket queens here, he's not gonna just fucking fold. It's very unlikely. And the problem with calling is, if the turn happens to be a king, if the turn happens to be an ace, if the turn happens to be a queen and he has pocket tens, or if he has pocket queens, then we're suddenly not getting his stack. We're not getting the extra 40 big blinds.
Classic min raise. And here I don't
Let's
see
what
something
Stefan
like
does.
ace, king, whatever with the club could be a min raise and then fold here, but this is not happening. He has queens, maybe he has jacks, he can have whatever, a flush draw, so I prefer to get it in here. I call with the aces with the club, not expecting.
Alright, now he says I call with the aces with the club. Fascinating statement here. Guys, tell me why that's not a very good idea. Tell me what's the logical inconsistency here. And this is kind of one of my big things in the poker world, is that people will narrow and hone down on one factor and one factor alone when making their decision, when it's actually a bigger multivariate analysis that you need to be taking into account. So I'm definitely open to a solver saying that when you have aces with the club here, you want to be calling. But we're not playing against another player that's playing GTO. We're playing against another player that just isn't fucking folding. So having the ace of clubs or not having the ace of clubs is so irrelevant in this kind of spot. It's so irrelevant. Like, yeah, okay, you're blocking him having some flush draws. Yeah, maybe you have some turns that you're still a lot happier on, but it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. way too much credit to blockers. Thank you very much, Aitor Kenito. It really is this kind of insanity, and he's not an insane person, but the poker world in general, having this mass formation psychosis, you could even say, about blockers, about making your strategy in a situation that's never going to come up again against the same person, so he's never going to be able to exploit you, and making a lower EV play based on blockers. And it is just lower EV. You know, we went through his range. Stefan had a slightly different range analysis. He put more flush draws in. I really don't think there's many flush draws when they min raise. But it's, you know, we have relatively similar range analysis, and none of the hands that he listed were going to be folding. So why do anything but shove? For me, that really is a misstep.
Not expect any folds here, so it's just a king could.
He even said it. He even said that he's not expecting any folds. So why on earth would you call with the aces with the ace of clubs? I would probably bet money that if I spoke to Stefan about it, he would change his mind on this. He might have just said that out of habit because he plays high stakes so much.
Kill my action. That's mainly what's going on here. Oh, there we have the king. So
yeah, king comes out. So the exact reason for shoving comes out on the turn. That if he does have something like tens or something like queens, and the king comes on the turn, or the ace comes on the turn, then we lose action.
To many of you, it may seem crystal clear that what Charlie was doing here was pure exploit and not GTO. Charlie made certain specific assumptions about the villain's play based on the fact that he is a recreational, and then designed a unique strategy to take advantage of the assumed imbalances and flaws in that strategy. However, recall that our definition of game theory simply was about evaluating the likely outcomes of taking various actions against the opponent's strategy, and then choosing the strategy that maximizes our payoffs on average. There was nothing in our definition which required that our opponent's strategy be perfectly balanced and adaptable. And this, in my opinion, is a prime example of why the GTO versus exploitative debate is largely semantics. The word game theory optimal isn't a universally defined term of art. There's no strict standard meaning that's well established, which I think is the cause of much of the confusion. If I had to guess, folks like Charlie essentially conflate game theory with solvers. That is, to many people, playing GTO means rotely adhering to the strategy produced by a solver in every spot. However, saying that game theory is the equivalent of a solver is akin to saying that math is the equivalent of a calculator. The reality is that the universe of mathematics exists outside of calculators, and a calculator is simply a tool that applies an arithmetical function to inputs provided by the user. A solver is the same. In essence, a solver is simply a calculator that applies a payoff maximizing function to whatever inputs the user provides. This means that if we change the inputs, the outputs are also changed, and this includes if we modify one player's strategy to be imbalanced. The solver doesn't know what balance or range advantage or blockers are. Its sole function is payoff maximization. If we allow a solver to run a hand scenario to completion without any interference, it assumes that both players are equal in their abilities to strategize and adapt to each other. This is referred to as a symmetrical game. But game theory also applies to games that are asymmetrical, including when one of the players has less experience or other inferior attributes compared to his opponent. In a way, you could think of a refined exploitative strategy as simply a game theoretic approach to an asymmetric game resulting from one player's imbalance or lack of skill. What this all means is that in reality, the actual disagreement between the GTO and exploitative camps is simply about what assumptions you should be making about your opponents, i.e. whether they are competent and adaptable, or incompetent and incapable of making adjustments. But regardless of what assumptions you make, the payoff maximizing functions that we apply to these inputs remain the same. To put it another way, if we punch 2 plus 2 into a calculator, it will produce an output of 4. And if we input 5 plus 5 into the calculator, it will produce an output of 10. The output depends entirely on the inputs, but the function in both situations is the same: addition. So if your goal is to maximize payoffs in poker, which I'm sure Charlie would agree with, why not make use of a learning tool that is literally a payoff maximizing calculator so you can better understand how that function works? Now, some of you may be thinking to yourself that against imbalanced players that are incapable of adapting, the strategy that maximizes payoffs will always be to exploit their weaknesses. And this is undoubtedly true. However, the issue is that in order to effectively exploit a player's weakness, you need to be able to identify his specific imbalances with a relatively high degree of certainty, because if your assumption is wrong, you could be punting off chips yourself. But this type of knowledge, as Charlie has admitted many times himself, typically can only be learned through significant experience or with detailed data analysis, which beginners generally do not possess. Ask yourself, how did Charlie and Stefan know with total certainty the types of hands Villain would likely have when he min-raised, and that he would call 100% of that range versus a shove? It's because they've seen this specific scenario over and over and over again. Both of these guys have been playing for many years and have grinded millions and millions of hands. In a way, you could actually view max exploit strategies as an advanced skill, which should be principally used by players with more experience. In contrast, a baseline equilibrium approach doesn't require millions of hands of experience, because if you're reviewing a sim correctly by studying how the entire range is constructed, not only are you learning how one hand should be played, you are essentially learning how dozens of hands should be played at the same time. And because solver outputs are objective and consistent, it makes pattern recognition, which is how most people learn poker, much more efficient. Additionally, GTO doesn't require you to get inside the head of each of your unique opponents and know how they play. You just assume that your opponent is competent and capable of making adjustments, and even when this assumption is wrong, which it will often be, your play will still be effective regardless of how your opponent actually plays.
Here are those trips.
So I think we see bet very small. Yeah, we see bet 25% on the flop. I like the size. I think that my whole strategy here would be based on a couple of things. I want him to try and bluff raise and represent a 6, and if you do smaller against a recreational player, they're much more likely to do that. And secondly, I want him to call all of his ace highs, because there isn't actually too much that we can get value from here. It's not like the board is 6-6 king, where we can just try and target all of his king x. Board's 6-6-3. Even if he has ace 3, the best 3x that there is, he ain't going to be giving us many chips at all. So what we want to be doing is we want to be focusing on other parts of his range and saying, okay, he has all of his ace deuce, ace 4, ace 5, ace 7, ace 8, ace 9, ace 10, ace jack, ace queen probably. Maybe it's ace king if he flats that. And we can go a size that all of those will call, and then, you know, his flush draws and straight draws might decide to raise, might decide to call as well. And then maybe they'll even hit something on the turn so we can get more value from it. So really be trying to think in these kind of situations, in many situations, what is your opponent going to be doing with ace high? It's such a big factor, and it's one of those things that still is very, very exploitable, even up to the highest stakes that you can play. Because people have this thing in their mind where they just play the ace highs the same no matter what. So they have like a million fucking combos. They have unlimited combos of ace highs. And if you can manipulate the way that a person plays based on that, it honestly, in so many spots like this one, it's absolutely printing. Even if you have something like Jack 10 here, you know, we'll zoom in on the board just for a second. So even if you had something like Jack 10 on the flop here, pretend the Jack's not there. You could go a size that his ace highs and maybe some of his king queens are going to be calling on the flop, and then go a size on the turn that they're all going to be folding. So you can actually almost value bet the flop with a bunch of bluffs here, because you know that he's going to be folding such a large percentage of his range on the turn.
Here are those trips 6s, so it is possible to flop trips at least, that's good. Here are those trips 6s, so it is possible to flop trips at least.
So sizing on the turn, definitely good in my opinion. We won't speak about it now because I think the river decision looks a lot more interesting. Definitely it's not as ideal with the flush coming in on the turn. However, the fact that the recreational player decided to pretty much snap call the turn means that he has a lot fewer flushes than he might otherwise. A flush, even if it wants to trap the turn, very often will consider raising in this kind of spot because there's so much to get value from. There's actually pretty much only one type of hand that we want to be trying to get value from here. Pretty much the entirety of the things that we're trying to get value from here, ace of spades and some other card. And it's actually a pretty decent proportion of his range. It's not that specific by the time he check calls the turn here, and especially when he snap calls the turn. So he has ace deuce with the ace of spades, ace 4 with the ace of spades, I guess ace 3 with the ace of spades as well, ace 5, ace 7, ace 8, ace 9, ace 10, ace jack, ace queen, probably not ace king. So many hands, ace x with the ace of spades. So now we've got that. And guys, remember, if you want to be thinking about how to value bet, think always, what is my opponent's range and what can I get called by? And how much can I bet they'll get called by? What is the biggest amount that I can bet that I will probably get a call from, or I'll definitely get a call from? You know, you have to kind of multiply it by the probability that it's going to call. So, how much do you think we can extract? Let's pretend he's got ace 10 with the ace of spades. How much do you think we can extract on the river? Maximum. What's the biggest number? I think my answer is going to be something like 25 big blinds. 25 big blinds. That's my intuition. And guys, whatever Stefan hit, and I guarantee he's thinking very similar things. It's a very, very simple spot for a good pro. Whatever he comes up with, that's going to be his intuition. Whatever I come up with, that's going to be my intuition. Whatever you come up with, that's going to be your intuition. So I have absolutely no fucking idea who's right. Personally, as an expert in exploiting recreational players, I would say around 25. But if the answer happened to be 16, if the answer happened to be 16, seems a bit small, but like maybe even 16, maybe even 15. If the answer happened to be fucking 40, I'm not going to be the person that tells you that ain't true. Just intuitively, something in me that's played millions of hands against recreational players, and this spot coming up a bunch of times in different variations, I'm saying about 25. Let's see what Stefan does.
The flush board is not great. We get the snap call. Snap call, he has all kinds of ace of spades, hopefully.
There we go. He noticed that there was a snap call and a snap call, and his brain instantly goes ace of spades.
With his 53 BPIP, so it's way more likely he has an offsuit hand that includes the ace of spades than a flush. So we have very clear value bet.
Ooh, too small.
He has some flushes, and
Oh.
just attacking that, sizing up a little.
He's gone exactly bot. I like it. I would have gone bigger myself. I don't think the people are calling like ace 10 with the ace of spades on the turn to fold to slight open.
I don't care about
whatever.
balance at all.
He might be right.
53,
Oh!
Attacking that, sizing up a little here against the 53-4 guy. Get the call.
Do we get the snap call?
Here against the 53-4
It's pretty
guy.
quick. Quick.
Get the call.
If we're playing a 53-4 guy, you can definitely go bigger, by the way. They're the kind of people that are stations more often than not.
And he had exactly what I was talking about. He had the ace of spades with
Got him, boys.
So it's just like, was not too tough to read people on hands here when you know, okay, he has all offsuit aces probably, and this is how he plays just all of them.
In this hand, Charlie couches his thought process in the vernacular of exploit and intuition. But I would argue that his approach is entirely a game theoretic one. On the flop, he says that he liked a small bet versus a large one because it would induce a greater number of raises and floats, and he then proceeded to identify a number of different combos in villain's range and how they were likely to react to a small bet. And on the river, he advised to bet large to specifically get called by top pair with the ace of spades. In reality, what Charlie was doing here was, in essence, the very same payoff calculation we discussed earlier that is central to game theory. He estimated the likely outcomes for the various actions that were available given villain's assumed range and strategy, and he then chose the actions that he thought would maximize his payoffs against that range. In poker, payoffs, of course, are referred to as expected value. EV for an action is determined by playing each potential hand out to a conclusion across all runouts, counter strategies, and potential hands of your opponent, and then multiplying each such outcome, i.e. the chips won or lost, by the probability of that outcome occurring. The action which results on average in accruing the greatest number of chips to you is the action that maximizes EV. And this is the exact process that Charlie's emulating here. For example, on the flop, he states that it's important to focus on how Ace X will react to our strategy. Now, why does he say this? Well, it's because in virtually every flop situation in poker, Ace X is the most common combo within both players' ranges. This in turn means that Ace X will often have a significant impact on the probability side of our EV equation. And since human beings aren't able to assess entire ranges or calculate outcomes across all possible scenarios, the best that we're able to do in a short amount of time is to focus on the combos that we think are the most prevalent in our opponent's range, because these are the combos that impact the EV equation most significantly. And then on the river, Charlie says that his preferred sizing was decided based on intuition. But was it really? Recall that he very specifically assessed the likely range of villain down to the exact combo he was actually holding, and concluded that villain would therefore likely call a large bet. Now granted, there is of course some intuition involved in any poker player's decisions, even very GTO-oriented players, such as deciding the exact number of chips to bet. But in this situation, Charlie literally recited the EV equation himself when evaluating sizing.
What is the biggest amount that I can bet that I will probably get a call from, or I'll definitely get a call from? You know, you have to kind of multiply it by the probability that it's going to call.
Of course, you can't actually calculate this equation in your head, so it has to be roughly estimated, but it seems quite clear that his decision was driven primarily not by intuition, but rather by conscious logic and reasoning. Charlie's claim that his decision was driven by intuition is actually very similar to what he asserted about Stefan in the last hand, where Stefan said that he would flat with the ace of clubs. From Charlie's perspective, this meant that Stefan was honing in on one factor alone to make his decision. However, in reality, Stefan very clearly and expressly considered the various hands villain was likely to have as the primary driver of his overall strategy, but then left himself with one exception to flat with the ace of clubs. This is not the same as saying that his entire decision was driven by one factor alone. Think about it. If you have a scale with $1 million on both sides, and then you add 1 penny to one end, it doesn't mean that that penny was the only thing that moved the scale, even though it ultimately tipped the weight in one direction. The same is true of using blockers. And some very sophisticated models even specifically reserved considering card removal until the last step of the analysis. So although I have no doubt that Charlie is being 100% sincere in his belief that he's playing purely exploitatively and intuitively, I think he overlooks the impact of the fundamental strategic logic that he uses, which he's developed from playing millions of hands over many years. And although Charlie has never used a solver before, people knew how to add and subtract long before calculators were invented too. Good plays are good plays regardless of how you arrive at them. Some paths are just much more efficient.
Worrying about 4-bets though, this is obviously pretty much 100% flat against 4-bets here, and bluffing as well, so reads are not strong enough to just randomly overfold ace-queen off against the 4-bet. This seems a little dangerous.
I don't see an argument for anything but call here. We are beating some of his bluffs and might be able to showdown if he just has some kind of air, and yeah, I don't see any argument for raising here. He can definitely have some king X, he can definitely have some jack X, he can definitely have aces, and he won't even fold something like queens if we do raise. So
definitely calling here, but it's always like the super strong sizings where they really size down, but
could be dead, but you can't just be thinking in the world of what if I'm dead. You have to be thinking about his entire range and how you play against it.
And yeah, I don't expect him to have pockets too often, but maybe pocket 10s, that's okay, but not 9s, 8s, 7s, so I do not need to try to fold them out or anything. I'm checking down, hoping to take it down on the river to just win.
Alright, so yeah, we're definitely following this. I don't think there's too much to say. We're just trying to take our ace queen to showdown here.
Showdown.
He checks the river. What are we doing? If we bet 14 bigs, I don't think 10s is going to be calling. I don't even know if queens is going to be calling. The only two options here, in my opinion, would be shove or check. And shove seems like a kind of crazy play. The idea for shove is to try and get folds from his ace X. So if you want to value bet, you're pretty much only targeting his king X. Let's say he's 4-bet something like king 4 suited. I don't know if it's going to be calling. It's very hard for us to be turning up with pretty much any bluffs here. A lot of the hands that we would be wanting to bluff here, fucking like 8-9 of diamonds, probably end up just betting the turn themselves. So it's very hard for us to come up with bluff here. Ace 10 and ace queens hit, a queen 10's hit. what are our bluffs going to be? We've got to get very, very creative to find bluffs. I don't know if we can even bet a size that King X will find. Maybe if we bet fucking tiny. So the downside to betting is that we now lose more if he does have something like pocket kings, which could definitely play it this way, and pocket jacks, which could definitely play it this way as well. Or king, I don't know if he 4-bets king jack over. Maybe king jack off, I'm not sure. Maybe even pocket aces. So there are definitely some traps in his range here. So this is the reason that I don't think shoving's any good. I don't think betting small is any good because, you know, getting shoved on would suck, and I don't know if he's going to call much king X. So I think the only option left by method of elimination is to check.
Any ace, so I need him to call a random king. I don't see that happening against a kind of tighter player. I'm just checking back that river top pair here. I see him trap some boats, and yeah, that's the pocket tens, the one hand we were talking about. That is.
So Charlie's thought process here on the river is a very good example of the EV calculation in practice. He considers the actions available to him and the likely outcomes, both positive and negative, of taking those actions versus villain's likely range. One such action he evaluates is making a small bet, but decides that it would be hard for villain to call with worse, and one of the reasons for this is that there are very few bluffs in hero's range by the river. Now, if only there was a word that we can use to describe the phenomenon of constructing a range that consists of both ample value and bluffs to disguise your holdings and to induce your opponents to bluff catch.
Balanced.
He also mentions the downside of betting, which is that Stefan could be potentially increasing the size of the pot against a better hand. In other words, Charlie determined that from a probabilistic standpoint, the upside of betting in terms of the potential positive outcomes of getting worse to call was lower than the downside of betting in terms of the potential negative outcomes of getting better to call or getting shoved on. And this thought process is a direct implementation of the EV equation.
Alright, so we're always going to be calling this this 3-bet. I think against absolutely everybody we're going to be calling this.
Tim Kenyon out.
So we got a half pot c-bet. Generally here I'm just going to be calling. If he starts going a little bit bigger than this, I think we start folding threes. I wouldn't be surprised if the solver fucking mixes it here. And this is the kind of spot that you're not going to get too many good reads. This guy's going to be using this size with probably his entire betting. I wouldn't be surprised if he's literally only using one size to c-bet on this kind of board in this kind of spot. So reads are going to be really difficult, and I'm just going to be playing some normal poke here and just calling. But I wouldn't be surprised if raising's fine. I wouldn't be surprised if folding's fine. So it all seems pretty close.
Is definitely trying to play, so we try to play as well and not overfold that flop. Half pot is a decent size he's using there. I have a random pick.
All right, he's checked on the turn. I'm honestly torn. I'm torn. I could definitely see an argument for betting small. I could definitely see an argument for checking. The normal way to play is to check. The normal way to play is to check, for sure. But if you wanted to start building a range that's, I don't know, this sounds pretty GTO. Guys, the amount of times I've recently read conspiracy theories about me saying that I'm just like super studied up on these solvers. Because every now and again I'll talk about constructing a range, or I'll talk about range advantage or shit like that. So yeah, I could see an argument for checking. I could see an argument for betting small. The point in betting small here is that we do have all of our 8-9 if we don't raise the flop. We have, some 2 pairs, we have all the sets. We have 10s, we have 7s, 6s, 5s. We have 8-9 some frequency, we have 7-8, we have 6-7, 5-7 suited. We have a bunch of nutted hands. So he's going to be checking a lot of hands on the turn here. He'll be betting some of his overpairs, checking some of his overpairs, checking some of his 10x, hands like that. And then loads of his like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, they're going to be checking as well. So I could see an art in king queen, king jack. I can see an argument for betting small to deny equity with these kind of hands against the king jacks of the world. And then we'll have some hands that are just going to be bet calling. We'll have some hands that are going to be bet folding, meaning that we bet and we fold to a raise, or bet and call a raise. And this would be one of the hands you could put in the bet fold strategy. That being said, checking is completely fine. We've got some equity. Maybe we hit a 4. Never know. Don't know about it. Maybe we get some value out of some stuff. Maybe we lose a ton of value and have an 8. He's checking a bunch of his 8x on the turn. So many factors. Your guess is as good as mine. Well, it's probably not. Your guess at least might be correct. So I think that I would probably lean towards betting small here, but I can definitely see an argument for checking.
Pair of threes, which is obviously not great. I can start betting some. I'm not sure about that hand though.
It's nice to see other good players find a complicated spot that I'm unsure about, and also be unsure about it. It's very affirming.
If I bet now river a 4, he has quite some 8x, so my upside is not too big. I can fold out his air, obviously, but
I love his action.
he has like king 9 suited, stuff like that. He has king jack of clubs. So I'll keep it in, and now if he bets, I have a random catcher. If he checks, I'm pretty much always winning.
I don't know about if he checks, I'm pretty much always winning. You know, he's got some 6x in there. He's got some 5x in there. And he might decide to bluff a bunch of his other cards. Anyway, so the question is, and I think this is a spot where I'd start getting a lot more exploit. The question is, what size does he go with his bluffs, and what size does he go with his value? This size, to me, feels very much like pocket 9s or a 10 or like ace 7s suited or something like this. I don't know if he 3-bets ace 7. I should probably learn what other people 3-bet. It feels like a very like one pairy kind of like not jacks plus kind of hand. Not even ace 10 plus kind of hand. Maybe like king 10 from maybe something like king 7 to king 10, that kind of range of hands, or a bluff. And the question is, if he had a bluff here, would he decide to go bigger to try and fold us off the exact kind of hands that we have, like, you know, 7, 8, 3s, something like that? I would actually expect him to probably go a bit bigger. So he can definitely be balanced here, but my read would be that his bluffs would often go bigger to try and rep something like aces. That would be my read, and to try and make us fold some hands like the one pairs, you know, the 5-4 suiteds and whatnot. So I'd probably fold him. I'd probably fold.
That sucks, because actually, like, on that 7 turn, he he checks quite some strong hands, because it's just such a good card for me. Though I'm unblocking all his bluffs, right? Not blocking value either. I don't have a read, so I will.
It's interesting that he's kind of resorting to his GTO here, and when he's unsure, and I'm resorting to my exploit when I feel like I have reads. So there's definitely two different styles of how one would go about playing 200 Zoom. Definitely both have merits to them. So he's unblocking all of his bluffs. You're also unblocking all of his value, so I don't know about that. But I guess it's more important you're unblocking his bluffs when you're bluff catching. In this kind of spot specifically, where it's going to be hard to be blocking too much of his value. So what are his bluffs going to be? It's going to be a lot of like you say, like king 9s, king jacks, king queens, hands like that. I honestly think I'd fold all of my bluff catchers, and you know, I'd fold even something like 7-8. It'd be hard to fold 7-8, but I'd be open to folding 7-8, and then 5-4 and fucking a6 suited and all the hands that I have that are bluff catchers. Just make a very, very exploit fold here, and then just play all the hands that beat his value hands. I just really feel like people would underbluff using this size, but this guy's a very fucking good player, so it's hard to be super sure on that, but that's just personally what I would do.
Enough for me for a catch this time. Yeah. King 10, right? That's fine. Half pot. That's like exactly what he reps.
So in this hand on the turn, when facing villain's check, Charlie first considered the nutted hand in Stefan's range, straights, sets, 2 pairs. He then considered the potential payoff of betting small with Stefan's 3s, which is folding out the overcards in villain's range. Implicit in this assessment is that betting with 3s is valid because it leverages Stefan's range advantage, thereby increasing fold equity, which of course is a very game theory oriented concept. He also mentioned that some hands go into the check bucket, some hands go into the bet call bucket, and some hands go into the bet fold bucket, and that pocket 3s could probably go into the check or bet fold buckets. What he was essentially doing here was he was constructing a range through combo allocation, which is the basis of how many GTO players in real life develop their balance strategies. That is, although balance certainly is a core concept in GTO, in reality no one knows the exact frequencies they should be taking in every spot, and they don't know the exact weights of all the combos in their range, especially if they randomize. So in practice, balance is achieved through a two-step process. One, you broadly determine how the most prominent segments in your range want to play, and then two, you allocate hands to these buckets through rational combo selection by focusing on the primary incentives of such combos against villains' assumed range. And when you do a good job of combo allocation for individual spots, what happens is your overall aggregate frequencies, which can be easily seen and exploited by opponents using a HUD, tend to be kept in check in the long run. And then on the river, Charlie decided that he would fold in this spot because he thought this medium bet likely represented a marginal one pair type of hand, and that from an exploitative standpoint, he would expect that if villain was bluffing, he would likely size larger. As it turns out, Charlie's assessment was spot on. But was Charlie being right here an endorsement of an exploitative strategy, or was it an endorsement of playing in a more balanced way to prevent aware players like Charlie from taking advantage of you?
Agreed.
This guy actually here is quite loose, so we cannot overfold, but against that big sizing, we need to adjust to the sizing. Queen 10 suited should be
Very close. Yeah.
I prefer to have a king or an ace for my 4-bets. I will do that call here, and seems like he just hit trip kings that we were looking for, or are looking for the whole.
So the solver's going to tell you to call. Stefan, I'm almost certain is going to be calling. The problem is, you just end up with so many fucking floats on these boards. So you have all your fucking jack 10 suiteds of the 3 suits, and then the queen 10s, and the ace queens, and the ace jacks.
Float here with our backdoor straight, backdoor flush draw. Unfortunately, not blocking king 10 and king queen suited.
He calls.
That he
A read is correct.
Some frequency as well.
If I'm the macro here, I'm checking probably my entire range. Maybe my entire range I'm checking on the turn. Maybe if I have a bluff like 7-8 I'm betting, or 6-7. But my entire showdown value range, including the nuts, I'm just checking that.
And against his check, this could be, I mean, it's quite a high frequency.
The problem is, and I'd feel very uncomfortable in these kind of situations, the problem is that you have so many bluffs in your range. The upside to betting it, you have to bet at some point. You basically just want to try and fold out when he has ace jack, ace queen. You know, those kind of hands. You gotta fold them out at some point. But then if you have something like queens, if you have something like nines, if you have something like a 5 somehow, if you 3-bet any of his 5x, which he probably does, he probably has some like fucking ace 5s, 6 5s, 4x as well then. You know, it's very hard to make people fold. But I'd probably just end up betting the turn and giving up river. I think that'd be my strat. I think I'd end up just, just like 25% turn, get him to fold all his ace-x, and then just give up river.
He stab, sometimes check back to bluff later. And yeah, holding out some random ace highs.
Alright, sticking with 25%, we like it.
Equity when called. Obviously, I can't value bet hitting a queen or a 10, but still sometimes winning, that's good.
You're hearing his voice, he doesn't like the spot. He's not happy with it. Yeah, look at that reaction. He's so unhappy with this spot.
I mean, now
This is the problem. When somebody c-bets small and you just float all of these hands. The problem with a lot of GTO players is they end up in a lot of these spots with way too many bluffs. And then even if you have something like fucking, you know, some shitty 2-pair hand, then you can end up justifying some pretty wild calls. Yeah, see, I'd make a very, very exploit check here. I imagine that Stefan's going to bet. Sizing-wise, I don't know if you can shove. You definitely want some shoves in there. I don't know if you can just shove all your bluffs. You probably can't. So you probably, in his mind, you probably want to be mixing between some shoves and some like 80%, something like that, to fold him out some 2-pairs. Put some of his 2-pairs in a rough spot. That's assuming that we're going to be value betting some like pocket jacks, things like that. So perhaps we're not even going to be doing that. Perhaps it's just a shove. It depends. So the thing is, you got to be thinking about how you're balancing it. Are you gonna value bet pocket jacks from his perspective? I'm not balanced like this, but from his perspective, are you going to be value betting pocket jacks and pocket tens? If so, we can start using quite a few bluffs like this and start going like 70%, 80%, hands like that. And then we have to throw in some fucking king X to balance it. Maybe. Then are you going to be shoving? Of course you want to be shoving if you have something like pocket fives, pocket eights, pocket fours. If we call pocket fours, which I assume we do, then we want to be having some shoves in there. So I would, if betting, I'd probably lean more towards a shove just to try and get him to fold all his shitty two pairs. But I wouldn't feel happy about it. I just really want to give up and move on to the next hand.
I mean, I don't want to have hearts, and yeah, I think that spot is actually fine.
Yeah. So the hearts thing is somewhat relevant. He has ace jack and ace queen of hearts. I just don't think it's relevant enough to be making these kind of decisions on in 200. Maybe if you're playing the super high stakes where everyone's a lot better at poker, then you want to be making some more blocker-based decisions because you want to be creating some kind of balanced strategy. I just don't know if the macro from 200 Zoom is going to be good enough that we want to be basing our strategy here based on blockers. I think that he's exploitable enough as a human being playing poker that we don't want to be making those kind of decisions when it's only a couple of combos, maybe 3 combos.
And I do float some 6-7s as well. I can play like that. I have 5s, obviously. I have ace king sometimes. I have king queen suited all the time. It's a little nicer if we have the lookalike, but here it's not possible, so I'll go for that jam here.
Jamming feels a lot better than going any other size. The fact that he didn't consider any other size makes me think he might just be checking back something like jacks if he has it there in tens. But I'm not sure. I'd be curious to know if a very good GTO player would value bet jacks and tens.
Pretty much wrapping king X plus. I can't value jam queens here.
Also, the problem is that this is the kind of spot where somebody might take all of their fucking bluff catchers and just bluff catch. There's an argument for bluff catching with pretty much fucking anything here. If he turns up with a 4, there's an argument because you don't block his bluffs. If he turns up with something like pocket jacks, you're near the top of his range. I can see a lot of people turn like just over calling because they have a bunch of reasons to do it. In reality, I imagine GTO would say, you'd rather call something like pocket, like a 4x, like ace 4 suited, than you would want to call something like pocket tens. But in reality, I don't know if people actually would.
So I expect him to never fold aces. So yeah, maybe my jam's actually not that great if I block queens and tens. But yeah, I was looking for the snap fold of ace queen, ace jack of hearts. This is the spots I don't like too much here these days because it's like I have the feeling that people just it's goose score that he will have the bluffs and then
exact same and
called. They do not do against.
So he calls with ace 5. It's one of those hands that we expected to be in there. It's one of those hands that's probably a good bluff catcher. He's blocking ace king, he's blocking pocket 5s, he's not blocking any of the bluffs. But how many hands would actually be in there? How many of those hands would he actually turn up with that he decides that all of those things are true? There might be a decent amount of them. I'm not a big fan of the shove, but whatevs.
So in this hand, Charlie indicates that he believes that GTO players overbluff this particular spot where they face a small c-bet and float because they end up having too many bluff candidates on turns and rivers. Now, from a solver perspective, the way you restrain yourself from overbluffing when you have many bluff candidates, and the way you keep your frequencies in check generally, is through the combo allocation process that we discussed earlier, where in the case of bluffing, you only allocate combos to the bluffing bucket that have the best card removal properties, such as only bluffing Queen 10 suited with the King X blockers. And in situations where all of the bluffing candidates are similar, you randomize based on how many value combos you have. However, instead of availing to card removal or randomization in close spots like this, Charlie says that he would prefer to rely on reads and other exploitative considerations. But this raises the question of what you should do if you don't have a read, which most beginners will not have. I don't think there's a single player on the planet that's adept at implementing GTO that would argue that a solid read shouldn't trump blockers or randomizing, and we've seen Stefan do this throughout this video. But if you don't have a read, a baseline GTO approach provides an objective methodology grounded in math to help you allocate combos in a rational way. In other words, just because you understand how to apply a baseline GTO strategy, it doesn't mean you must apply it in every situation. On the other hand, if you never study GTO, you will likely not have the tools to make a rational decision in a spot like this when you don't have any reads, which for a beginner will be often.
We are pretty much always just going to be c-betting small on this board. There aren't too many hands that we're going to be checking. It's a really nice kind of spot for us to have range c-bet here.
Start off betting, it's pretty much a brick board, doesn't hit anything of that.
So the idea is, what is his range? What are we going to do about it? His range is going to be a bunch of pocket pairs, some 7x, some 8x. The 8x we pretty much just ignore, and the pocket 7s we just ignore because we're going to get stacked by them no matter what. Then he has some jack 10s, he has some 10 9s, he has some ace x, maybe like ace queen with queen hearts, those kind of hands. Maybe even some, just something like ace queen off, ace jack off. And then he's got some flush draws, and he's got some other flush draws, spades and hearts. I'm not sure what's best. No idea. If we check, we're allowing a lot of his hands to check back and realize equity. Now, having the ace of hearts and the ace of spades makes this more of a check. I don't know if I'd make my decision based on that. In fact, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't. But GTO is very likely going to want you to check these kind of hands, because now it doesn't have all the ace x of spades, so they're definitely going to be checking back. The ace x of hearts, which is definitely going to be checking back. I think I'm going to lean towards a bet, just because I think so many of his hands will end up checking back and then bluffing rivers, just from like a kind of exploit perspective here. And then we want to stack pocket sixes. So the idea, then the question is, how much do we bet? Do we want to shove, or do we want to bet small? I'm actually tempted to just shove, honestly. It might be a complete punt to shove. It might be a complete punt. But we get him to call all his pairs, definitely. If he has something like, I don't know what else he calls actually. It might be a punt to shove. I just can't think of any good size. What did you guys come up with? I think I'm leaning. Let me meditate. I'm leaning towards bet small. I think there's still enough hands like 10-9 that we just have in pretty dire shape. Hands that might decide to shove the turn themselves. Something like 10-9 of spades. Maybe something like jack 10 of spades. And then we obviously get to call off and have good equity against that. I don't know though. This is all kind of like feeble reasons. It's all really close. I'm gonna say that this isn't something that we should be analyzing too much. It's all very, very close. If somebody tells you that they know what the right answer is, 100% certain, they have no idea how to play poker, because there's way too many factors to be able to decide this.
Both flushes. I can keep betting small. I can start checking. It's both fine. I think against him, I just prefer to keep betting.
So interesting. He didn't consider shoving, which is definitely worth noting. I can see why. I can see it. I can see the argument for shoves being a punt. It just feels like everything's kind of okay. Everything's plus EV. Whatever you do is gonna be fine. Against this, I don't know what it means by against this kind of player. Maybe he thinks he's more stationary. Maybe he thinks he's less bluffy. Something like that. And on the river. So check would make some sense from a kind of GTO perspective. I think I'm leaning towards a shove though. So the argument for shoving would be a lot of his hands, like 10-9 suited, might end up just shoving turn themselves. Would they end up bluffing the river themselves? Or 10-9, 10-9 of spades might not. 10-9 of hearts probably not in there. 10-9 of clubs would, 10-9 of diamonds would. What other hands are in there? You know, the other bluffs he's got all his 5-6s if they're not shoving. So he's got probably at least 2 combos of 5-6 suited, and then maybe throw in an extra one for when he mixes the other 2. Does he shove any of his 2 pairs? You know, if he's got ace-7 here, you know, if he's got 7-6 suited, no, he's just going to be checking them behind. So I think shove's good. I think shove's good. Check is terrible.
And now I think
apparently,
this is actually good
according
to check.
Well, you're saying 10 Natch Krusky. You're saying goose score is terrible.
Good jacks, which some people are not capable of. But yeah, let's try to play it for real.
Wait, what do you say?
Which some people. I just need him to still value bet pocket jacks, which some people are not capable of.
Yeah.
But
yeah, makes sense.
Let's try to play it for real.
I think most regs will shove jacks in. So I think if that's reasoning, that's a good assumption on his range. But I think that it's, for me at least, I think that I'm just going to be shoving all of my value hands in, and not worrying about all these fucking blockers and whatnot. How thin do I shove? Maybe 9s?
Flush draws that check back, that's like blocking all his check back range. He has 8-7 suited at that point.
So Charlie here does another great job of modeling how to, in practice, utilize a game-theoretic EV maximizing approach to derive decisions. Note on the turn how he says that you can ignore pocket 7s and 8x in this spot because aces are getting stacked no matter what against these hands. What Charlie is doing here is he is essentially simplifying the EV formula by reducing the number of variables that need to be considered. Recall that EV is calculated by assessing for each action all possible outcomes and weighting those outcomes by their probability to occur. Well, what happens when a particular outcome is the same no matter which action you take? These outcomes negate each other and therefore can be removed from our calculation and our thought process to simplify the EV formula. And after meticulously thinking his way through this EV maximization formula, Charlie admits that he isn't quite sure what to do, which will often mean that there are multiple actions with the same or similar EV. But he again dismisses the use of blockers to guide his decision, even though they would seem to be relevant in this spot. Instead, he ostensibly arrives at his preference of betting small through meditation. But was that really how his decision was made? After meditating, he very cleanly articulates the exact combos he would be targeting with a small bet to maximize EV, with the goal of inducing some thin value calls and some shoves from weaker hands. And this, I think, highlights another area where there appears to be a significant disconnect between what people say is important and what is actually important. Meditating, mindset, and the practice of presence have swept across the poker community like a wildfire in recent years. And although, of course, just like any other performance activity, mindset can have a significant impact, I think there's a tendency for it to be a bit overemphasized, especially when we're talking about beginners. You have very experienced and skilled players like Charlie who speak frequently about presence and meditation, but one thing we have to keep in mind is that these guys already have a very strong foundational base built over many years of play. For these very experienced players, focusing on the advancement of skills often won't be at the forefront of their minds because once you reach the top level, it becomes harder and harder to make incremental improvements in skills. So these very advanced players will often direct most or all of their attention on the edges, on little things that can boost their performance by 3% or 5%, for example by accessing and unlocking their full potential, which mindset training will undoubtedly help with. The problem is that beginners do not have the same foundation of skills which I think many advanced players take for granted. For example, to an experienced player, it may seem very obvious that a particular villain's range looks like X, Y, or Z in a specific spot, but for most beginners, they have no idea what anyone's range looks like or even what a range is. In reality, in order to understand what a rational range looks like, beginners need to first be given a consistent framework of how to play, and then over time, by implementing that framework over and over, they will eventually become familiar with the types of hands that typically show up in various spots.
So let's focus on that here. We were three-way on the flop, small blind did call.
So I think ignoring my creative idea of trying to lead the flop small, I think the only answer here is that we check call. Raising here, it's kind of turning your hand into a bluff, but you're actually not going to make any better hands fold. Even though you have a ton of equity against everything pretty much, it's still not good enough to raise.
Call as well, facing that c-bet of super splashy Russian player.
Ooh, super splashy.
Obviously,
good to know. Makes it more of a call. So now we know what that label means, which is nice. Guys, 1 to fold, 2 to call, 3 to raise. What are you doing? 1 fold, 2 call, 3 raise. 2. Everyone else says 2. Yeah, 2.
Good call.
Good. No teaching here. Oh.
And yeah, another one. We don't catch our runouts today.
Nice that he tanked on the river there, not giving away any timing tells. Alright, he shoves. I'm pretty sure GTO is going to tell you to fold this. I'm going to go out on a fucking limb here and say GTO is almost definitely going to be telling you to fold it. But let's think from an exploit perspective here. What kind of bluffs has he got? He's got potentially all of his Jack 10. Definitely if he has a spade in it. How big did he bet? I don't think he's going to turn up with King 10. Unless it's specifically like King of Spades, 10 of Clubs. I don't think he's going to be overbetting the turn with that. Same with King Jack. I just don't really think it's too much of that. So his bluffs are really going to be a lot of Jack 10. If he decides to overbet turn with that, Jack 10 diamonds or whatever. What other bluffs has he got? I don't know. People tend not to bluff their missed clubs in these spots. You know, if he's got something like King Jack of Clubs, he's probably just checking it. Yeah, Jack 8, I don't know, overbetting the turn, it's very, very hard to just use a fucking random Jack 8 here. I don't think he would. I can't think of any other bluffs apart from Jack 10. And like the odds fucking like King of Spades, 10 of Clubs. Splashy Russian makes it definitely more enticing to call. No, I'm pretty sure you just meant to fold this. Like GTO is going to tell you to fold, Exploit is going to tell you to fold. How many value hands does he have is definitely a question you need to be asking, but you know, if I'm him, I'm value shoving a set here. You know, I'm value shoving pocket 5s even, which gives me 5s, 6s, maybe even fucking ace queen. I might even value shove ace queen. Maybe ace queen a bit loose, but if I'm me, I'm value shoving ace queen. I don't know if I'm him. If I've got a splashy Russian image, I might be value shoving ace queen. If he's value shoving as wide as ace queen, then this is going to be a disastrous score. If he's only value shoving a flush, which is possible because it is an overbet shove on the river, then this might be a call because he would have had to c-bet overbet turn with it. Which there aren't too many combos of it. There aren't too many combos of flushes that would do that. Is he going to value bet straight? I think he's going to value shove a straight in a set. My assumption is that he's going to be value shoving pretty wide. If he's not, then if he's literally only value betting a shove, and he's a splashy guy, I can definitely see an argument. Just from all the Jack 10s alone, it might even be enough combos and bluffs. But I think that if he's value shoving a set, which I believe he is, maybe even ace queen, then I think it's a quite easy fold.
It's very, 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 very tempting to call against that guy because he's just like not jamming thinly here. I have 9x and 6x of spades, pretty much all of them. And that means he needs to have a flush.
That doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel right. So obviously our flushes are basically all of the hands. Well, we also have a couple of others. We have King 10 of spades, King Jack of spades, 9x of spades, 6x of spades. It just feels like somebody's gonna shove wider than that. It just feels like it is. I'm not sure.
Or he's bluffing and he's like a freaking bluffing machine, having like Jack 10 with a spade, King Jack with a spade, King 10 with a spade.
See, I don't know if he's going to take those hands and bluff. I might be proven completely wrong here, but I don't know if he's gonna just turn up with Jack 10 with the Jack of Spades and no club in his hands and just overbet the turn here. I'm not sure about it. Or like maybe not Jack 10, maybe like King 10 with a King of Spades. I don't know if he's gonna overbet the turn there because it's hard to make much of our range fold on the turn. It's a very confusing spot because nobody knows what anyone's range is. It's very unsolved for how humans actually play. So with some assumptions that if he is really only value betting a flush, which I don't think is true, but if it is true, then I can see this being just call all of your bluff catches pretty much. But I don't think that's right. I think I'm just folding.
And I actually think I like a catch here without being chilled. Like I have big history with that guy, and let's go crazy for once. Okay, he has the...
Yeah, alright. So we know he's value betting a straight, which means that we probably also know he's value betting a set as well. Which is not too much of a stretch to say he might be value betting ace queen as well. So if a straight is in there, then Goose kind of got owned in this spot, which is it's like a weird own where like if you played these guys heads up or they play 6 max, Goose is going to win more often than this guy for sure. But in this kind of spot, he value bet a hand that's like close, and he thought that he wasn't going to value bet these kind of hands. So it's like a kind of own there. It was interesting. That was definitely an interesting hand. It was it's one of those things where you can be any poker player in the world, and you don't know what this guy's range is going to be. So all you have to fall back on is your intuition and your intuition of what other people are going to be turning up with. And it's hard. It's hard to know how other people are going to be playing. And the only way to really do that is play a lot of poker and think a lot about poker.
So Stefan finds himself in a tricky river spot, and in Charlie's view, this is a fold from both an exploitative and GTO perspective, which raises a couple of interesting points. One, notice that not just in this hand, but in a number of spots before this, Charlie was able to quickly assess what quote-unquote GTO would do in a given situation, which seems to be proof positive that he understands what a baseline strategy looks like, even if he chooses not to implement it in all circumstances. And I think you'll be hard-pressed to find any successful poker player, even so-called exploitative ones, that don't have at least some sense of what a baseline GTO strategy generally looks like, which should tell you something. Secondly, he claims that his decision was made again by falling back on intuition. However, he clearly went through a very in-depth analysis of Villain's possible value combos and bluffs, and how Stefan should be playing based on those assumptions, which seems to me to be much more logic-driven. Yes, it is true that in reality we don't know for certain whether our assumptions about Villain's range are correct, but in my mind, this uncertainty actually reinforces the notion that a baseline GTO approach, where we just assume that our opponent is competent and adaptable and has a reasonable range, will oftentimes be the simpler path for a beginner. It's precisely because we do not have the capacity to read our opponent's minds that a strategy which is built around countering each of your opponent's weaknesses can be incredibly difficult to pull off. If we're constantly attempting to take advantage of imbalanced opponents, not only do we open ourselves up to exploit if we're wrong, but we can actually make the game much more complex, since the reality is that every single opponent is unique and plays differently. Think about it. When we use a solver-based equilibrium approach, we only have to master one game tree. That game tree is complex, but it's just one tree. However, when we use an approach that attempts to maximally punish each opponent's weaknesses, essentially we have to master not just one game tree, but multiple game trees depending on the opponent. And while it is also true that a max exploit strategy is capable in theory to win you more EV compared to an equilibrium strategy, remember that the whole context of this discussion is about beginners, and most beginners play low stakes. Does it really make sense for a beginner to attempt to develop a strategy that first of all requires many hands of experience, and secondly will need to be continuously updated as he changes stakes, locales, and playing environments, all for the sake of eking out a few additional big blinds here and there? At 10 NL, what are you really going to do with the extra 30 cents per 100 hands that you earn from taking advantage of players' weaknesses? I think for most, the ultimate goal is to reach the highest levels. And if you need a theory-based strategy to succeed at those highest stakes, which most, including Charlie, agree is true, And if this theory-based strategy is also effective at every stage before that, why not start off learning it from the very beginning?